All right, so welcome back to our lecture on causality. For the second and final video of this lecture, we're going to review the Bradford-Hill tenets, or Bradford-Hill criteria, as they're sometimes called. I'm sorry, getting too much into causality. To give you a framework for understanding this, in 1965, Bradford-Hill published a study called The Environment and Disease Association or Causation, in which he described 9 aspects that should be considered for assessing evidence and causality. Essentially what he was trying to do, and this was related to the first Surgeon General's report on tobacco, and when we were really starting to understand the full implications of tobacco use, and that tobacco companies had been starting to hide data and lie about, health outcomes that they knew were caused or associated with tobacco. But it's also, around the time the problem was, and it still is, that we can't ethically develop studies to truly find out that smoking causes lung cancer. And because the reason for that is that we can never assign someone or one group of people to smoke and assign another group of people not to smoke, because that's unethical. We have strong enough evidence that smoking is harmful, and so we can't ethically make someone smoke to see what happens to them. We can do that to animals, but not to humans. So this is the context in which Bradford-Hill published this series of guidelines for thinking about causality. And the idea originally was sort of that if the body of evidence around a certain exposure outcome relationship meets these criteria, then we feel more comfortable talking that something is a cause. And I will say my personal belief is that these criteria are useful, but what I would much rather you do is to start with the idea of the counterfactual, and what is the counterfactual in this situation, and what do we need to accomplish? How close can we get to observing the counterfactual, and what's getting in our way? And that will tell you a lot more about causal relationships than a checklist here. But I'm going through the checklist because I do believe there are important pieces, and it's a little more tangible in terms of the idea of causal inference than perhaps the causal pies. So also, one of the things Bradford-Hill said is that statistical methods cannot establish the proof of a causal relationship. The proof that a causal relationship is an association. So, no, I'm sorry, I read that totally wrong. Statistical methods cannot establish proof of a causal relationship in an association. So just because you run statistics and you say, oh, these two things are really strongly correlated, they must be causal. Statistics can't tell you that something caused something else. They can't tell you that if you removed your exposure, your disease wouldn't happen. That takes much more sort of holistic thinking about things. So Bradford-Hill felt that to judge or evaluate the causal significance of association, a number of criteria must be utilized. So let's go through these criteria. Okay, and I'm going to give you an example. I don't know why I have such a hash mark on that. We're going to, as we go through the criteria, we're going to make them very concrete by going through the question of, can breastfeeding prevent childhood obesity? This has been a question for a long time, and some people have said, or the AAP says, that one of the most highly effective preventive measures a mother can take to protect the health of her infant is to breastfeed. So the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends exclusive breastfeeding through 4 to 6 months, and then continued breastfeeding. Nationwide in the U.S., 75% of women report ever breastfeeding, but this drops dramatically from 3 to 6 months. And so it's a major public health effort, in part because there's a contingent that really believes that breastfeeding is a causal factor in preventing obesity. There's a real effort to get everyone breastfeeding. And I'm not bringing up the argument of whether breastfeeding is good or bad, or whether what we're doing is right or wrong. We're purely going to start to go through the evidence and hopefully get you thinking, is there enough evidence to say that breastfeeding prevents obesity? Well, let's see. Okay, so the first of the Bradford-Hill criteria, and also I'll just tell you guys, I'm presenting sort of a truncated list of Bradford-Hill criteria because I think that some of them are more applicable to the types of public health topics that we're sort of dealing with today, and are more useful in helping you think about causal relationships. So you may see a different list in the Ocean textbook or other places. Okay, but the first Bradford-Hill criteria that I want to talk about is temporal relationship. And this is the idea, as simple as it sounds, that exposure to the factor must occur before the outcome develops. So the two things can't happen simultaneously. It can't be that, you have your outcome and then your exposure happens. For something to be a cause, it must happen before the effect. And as I said before, sometimes we actually have a very hard time disentangling cause and effect, right? So you can imagine the question of, dietary patterns and cancer. So can we study what someone ate before they got cancer, or are the data we have what they're eating after diagnosis? Well, you can imagine a cancer diagnosis dramatically changes what someone's eating. So this temporal relationship is difficult to disentangle. And there's a particular type of epidemiologic study, which we're going to learn about after the midterm, called prospective cohort studies. And those are where we identify a group of well people and we follow them over time to see what health outcomes accrue. And so they provide stronger evidence than our cross-sectional studies, which we learned about, as well as some other types of studies. So we'll learn about these types of studies again after the midterm. So in terms of temporal relationship, in terms of that the exposure has to happen before the outcome, what do we know in terms of breastfeeding? So if we go with the question, does breastfeeding versus formula feeding occur before an onset of higher weight or rapid weight gain? Again, it seems like a simple question, but actually it's very difficult research-wise to really capture, what came first, the breastfeeding or the weight. So many studies of breastfeeding are cross-sectional, and you guys know what a cross-sectional study is. It happened at one point in time, and so what they do is they measure, say they measure a baby, and then they ask the mom about her feeding habits. Well, as you can imagine, it's very hard to know. You cannot know, okay, did the baby gain weight and then mom changed their habits, or did mom's breastfeeding habits lead to this weight? You just can't know that when you're only asking at a single point in time. And some reasons why this relationship could sort of be backwards from what we think is that, so having a smaller baby at birth may lead women to use a particular feeding choice. So perhaps women who have smaller babies at birth are more concerned about weight gain, so they give them a little extra formula versus just breastfeeding. And then maybe those smaller babies rapidly gain weight, not because of the formula, but because, that's what small babies do, right? So in this case, it was sort of a baby's potential for growth that drove mom's feeding choice. And then, flip that idea. It may be that rapid weight gain in babies may lead to women supplementing with formula because they perceive that their bigger baby must be hungrier. So again, here's another situation where the weight gain actually led to feeding with formula versus formula leading to weight gain. So hopefully you can start to see that, actually like sort of an ideal world where if you knew everything that every mother did and every decision she made, you may be able to disentangle cause and effect. But in reality, it's kind of difficult. Okay, so the second Hill criteria that I want to introduce you guys to is biologic plausibility. So for any exposure disease outcome, we would hope that there's a biologically plausible mechanism to explain the relationship between the exposure and the outcome, right? And you don't need to, have explicitly studied that or to understand everything about physiology, but we need some biological basis of why do I believe that this factor could be a cause of my outcome. So in terms of the breastfeeding-obesity relationship, there are a number of biologically plausible reasons why breastfeeding may lead to less weight gain. So we know that breastfed babies metabolize less energy and protein from their food sources. So they're not kind of using everything up. We also know that there's greater insulin response in formula-fed babies that may stimulate fat deposition. So babies may gain fat in different ways when they're formula-fed versus breastfed. We also know that when mother feeds from the breast versus a bottle, the infant, and this is more of a behavioral thing than a biologic thing, the infant has different regulation, right? So often when moms are feeding with bottles, they sort of are like, oh, well, the baby needs to finish the bottle, and that doesn't happen with breastfeeding. So that's another way that breastfeeding could be protective against child obesity. Similarly, you know, when you're breastfeeding, you don't have those cues from the bottle. You don't have baby, you know, oh, I know my child takes 4 ounces and they eat at these times. It's a much more, or people think it's a much more sort of natural relationship where mom is responsible to baby. The other final biologically plausible mechanism is that babies who are breastfed, you know, have been exposed to different flavors from mom, so maybe they're more amenable to healthier foods later on, right? So these are just a number of hypothesized reasons, biological mechanisms through which, okay, I could sort of get that breastfeeding would be preventive for child obesity. So, you know, you can make a call. Have we, you know, checked off biologic plausibility as yes, we've met that criteria. I won't say either way. Oops, sorry. Okay, so another Hill criteria is replication of findings. And the idea here is that evidence for causality is stronger if the association is replicated in different populations by different researchers at different times using different study designs. Basically, if we're able to approach this research question from a number of different perspectives, different populations, different measures of breastfeeding, babies of different ages, babies of different races, whatever it is, and if we have consistency of those findings, that gives a little stronger evidence that, okay, we actually have a causal relationship. Now, of course, I want you guys to keep in mind that, you know, it could be that every single one of these researchers did their study wrong, right? Or it could be that every single one of these researchers did a cross-sectional study where they can't disentangle what came first. That certainly could be the case, but generally in public health and medicine, we like to build an evidence base. We don't just make decisions off of one study, but we can see when ideas are starting to be replicated. So in terms of breastfeeding and later obesity, the figure we're seeing right now is from a meta-analysis. So this is something where someone has taken every single study on breastfeeding and obesity incidents and looked at what relationship did the investigators find in each of these studies. And we're going to later talk about odds ratios, but the idea that, in this figure, the odds ratio of 1 means that there's no relationship between breastfeeding and obesity. For dots that are on the left side of the 1, it means that breastfeeding is protective against obesity. And then on this side, it means that breastfeeding might actually be a risk, or a flip way of thinking about this is that formula may be protective against obesity. So what we're seeing is that across these, 20-something studies, every single one of them found a relationship that's on the left side of the line that adds evidence for the breastfeeding is better relationship. And this little diamond-shaped box is showing essentially sort of the average relationship they found. So across all these different things, these studies, the average relationship between breastfeeding and obesity shows that breastfeeding is protective. So that's some replication of findings, right? We've got consistency, and then across all of them we see some protective factors in terms of breastfeeding. Okay, so the next Bradford-Hill criteria that I want you guys to consider is that, have these studies of the exposure and the outcome that you're interested in really explored all alternative explanations? And in this case, we're coming back again to this idea of confounding. So is there truly, do we feel like we've removed all these other third factors, all these other correlated things that people do together to isolate the independent relationship between our exposure and our outcome? Or have we not explored other options? Are there things that are correlated? Are there third factors mixed up in there that could explain what we're seeing? Okay, so let's go to our example of breastfeeding and obesity, right? So we are interested in the exposure. We're talking about the exposure, breastfeeding, and the outcome of obesity. And there's a lot of third factors. There's a lot of correlated exposures in terms of breastfeeding, right? So we actually know that heavier mothers are less likely to breastfeed. There are some biological reasons for that. There are some social reasons for that. But low breastfeeding is actually correlated with maternal obesity. So there's something else that's sort of mucking things up. So the question becomes, is it really breastfeeding that's protective against obesity, or is it just the fact that heavier mothers are less likely to breastfeed, and then heavier mothers have heavier babies? So this is really all about mother's weight status. Similarly, mother's education and household income and these other measures of SES, so lower SES mothers are less likely to breastfeed. We also know that low SES is a risk factor for obesity. So again, maybe it's not about breastfeeding and obesity. Maybe it's about that these mothers who formula feed are of lower socioeconomic status, and that's the true relationship that we care about. So when we're looking for evidence of alternative explanations and how we address confounding, you need to start answering these questions of, have we ruled out all these other correlated exposures that could actually be masking the relationship that we care about? Okay, so our next Bradford-Hill criteria that we use to evaluate whether something is a causal relationship is the question of whether there's a dose-response relationship. And the idea here is that in a dose-response relationship, the level of the outcome varies in response to the level of the exposure. Simple terms, the more you're exposed to something, in theory, or in most cases, the worse your outcome's going to be. There are some situations where that doesn't exist, and that's totally fine, but this is just one of the criteria where we say, oh yeah, there's a dose-response relationship. The more someone smoked, the younger they got lung cancer, dose response. So let's look at this in terms of the association between breastfeeding and obesity. And so in this figure, we're looking at black women or black children versus white children. And you can see that among white children, the more weeks of breastfeeding they were exposed to, the lower the prevalence of obesity, right? So this is a cross-sectional study where we were able to get prevalence of obesity. We took a group of kids, we said, how long were they breastfed for? And we were able to plot the prevalence of obesity. So in this case, for whites at least, we have a dose-response relationship. We can see that, there's a trend that the longer someone is exposed to breastfeeding, the less likely they are to be obese. What happens in black babies, though? Among black babies, we're seeing that there's actually really not much difference about whether babies were breastfed for, a very short amount of time or, up to 6 months. And then actually we're seeing that babies over 6 months have a much higher prevalence of obesity. So this is, starts to make you wonder, gosh, is there any reason, if breastfeeding truly is a protective biological factor for obesity, shouldn't we see the same relationship, and shouldn't we see a dose-response relationship among all of our populations? So I think this sort of raises some questions. It certainly raises some questions, what's going on with black mothers who breastfeed for more than 6 months? Are they sort of a different type of mom where there might be other things going on? They may parent their children in a different way that may result in this higher prevalence of obesity. So that goes back to the idea of confounding. But this should raise the question with you is, well, we see a dose-response relationship sort of among whites, but not in blacks. So I don't think we can sort of check off dose-response relationship as evidence of causality in this relationship. Okay, so the last Bradford-Hill criteria I'm going to introduce you to is strength of association. And this is the idea that the stronger the relationship, the less likely that there are clear alternative explanations that haven't been accounted for. So basically, if exposure to something increases your risk of getting a disease by 2%, that's kind of a weak relationship. If exposure to something raises your risk of getting a disease by 200%, that's a pretty strong relationship. And the idea there is that, when you have such a strong relationship, it becomes less and less likely that there's something else that you didn't consider that could be causing this. We can go through, we'll deal with this when we have confounding, but just know that, while it's not hard and fast rule, and we certainly can make errors in our studies such that we can end up with a 200% increased risk of disease from an exposure when it's not a true causal relationship. In general, the belief is that if there's a stronger association, if we're seeing a really strong association, there's something there. So if for breastfeeding and obesity, if we go back to that figure from our meta-analysis and look at some numbers, we see that the difference between breastfed and formula-fed babies was a difference in mean BMI of negative 0.04 BMI units. Very, very small difference. Breastfeeding was accountable for a very small difference in mean BMI among babies. There's a lot of wiggle room there, a lot of potential that something else is explaining that relationship, and would, potentially if we looked at things a different way, there'd be no relationship between the two. And then if we look at, the risk of obesity among babies who had any breast milk exposure versus none, breastfeeding was associated with a relative risk of 0.87. So going back to our chart above, that is less than 1. It's protective. You'll learn about this later. Or a 13% increase, I think that should be decrease, decrease in obesity risk. So kids who received any breast milk had a 13% decrease in obesity risk. It's okay. We'll take a 13% decrease, but I wouldn't say it's astounding. It's not like your risk of being obese is cut in half if you're breastfed. So I would say the strength of association in the breastfeeding-obesity relationship is pretty middle of the road, pretty mediocre. Okay, so just to conclude our breastfeeding-obesity journey, I pulled out this quote. It appears doubtful whether there will ever be a study conducted that has the appropriate methodology and statistical power to yield substantial and undisputable evidence for or against the protective effect of breastfeeding against childhood overweight. So what they're saying is that, you know what, guys, we just can't do it. There is just no good way to disentangle all this stuff and figure out truly if breastfeeding is a cause of, or alternatively, formula feeding is a cause of childhood obesity. Okay, and I just thought that, oh, you missed that little guy. Anyway, it's a funny little picture. Okay, so there are Bradford Hill criteria. Hopefully you got a sense of what we mean by the 6 of them that I talked about today. And thanks a lot.